Good evening and welcome, everyone. And thanks for braving the rain. I'm sure we'll have some people, this is not meant to be a pun, trickle in a little bit later now that it's cleared up. But welcome to tonight's event at the IOP. We are winding down our speaker series, and we hope these conversations have proven enlightening and thought-provoking for you as the year has gone on. Tonight's panel is going to be really interesting, and we will learn that the campaigns know us better than we know ourselves. But before I turn it over to Adam to introduce it, I just want to tell you next week, upcoming, on Monday evening, Austin Goolsbee and Steve Moore will be, Tuesday evening, Monday's a holiday, Tuesday evening at the Quad Club. They will be talking about the economy and debating varying viewpoints on the economy. And on Wednesday, Chance the Rapper will be here. That's sold out, but watch our website for how you can watch what promises to be a really engaging conversation with him. Adam Beisman, who will be introducing tonight's program, is a second year from Nashville, Tennessee, and he has been incredibly active with the IOP. He's on our student advisory board. He's a leader of college Republicans, and he is I can't even say it. He is a statistics major who will be working in DC this summer. So Adam, take it away.
Thank you for the kind intro. I'll actually be working with Alex over there, so I'm excited for that. But over the last few election cycles, campaigns have become much more sophisticated. They've been able to tap into so much more data about us than we may know, such as customer tendencies, magazine subscriptions, internet searches, and more than you can think of. Here to flesh out about what campaigns might or might not know about you are Alex Lundry on the left, Tom Bonnier, and Sasha Eisenberg. Alex Lundry began his career in data science as a senior manager at the Luntz Research Group. After a short stint with the Luntz Research Group, Alex worked as a chief data scientist at Target Point Consulting. Since then, Lundry has served as a political pollster, micro-targeter, data miner, and data visualizer for presidential candidates, national organizations, and Fortune 50 companies. Within the realm of politics, Alex was the director of data science for Romney 2012 and Jeb 2016. Right now, Alex is the co-founder of Deeproot Analytics, a center-right firm that studies big data for television marketing. Joining Mr. Lundry is Tom Bonnier, an esteemed Democratic strategist. Tom began his career in political strategy with the NCEC, National Committee for an Effective Congress, where he became the COO in 2010 for 2 years. After working with the NCEC, Tom founded Clarity Campaign Labs, which creates voter contact models and micro-targeting, persuasion targeting, and experimental testing for Democratic campaigns. Tom is currently the CEO of Target Smart Communications. Finally, moderating this evening's discussion is Sasha Eisenberg, who is most prominently known for his book, The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. Currently a contributor to Bloomberg Politics, Sasha was a columnist for Slate during the 2012 election and a national political reporter for the Boston Globe in 2008. Please join me in welcoming our guests this evening.
Thank you all. So we got tasked with a big subject because there's a whole lot of data about voters and a whole lot that campaigns and parties do with it. But the sort of question of what is it sort of bumped into the news recently when the likely Republican nominee told the Associated Press in an interview, I think last week or the week before last, when asked if he would develop an analytics operation, quote, "I've always felt it was overrated," unquote, Trump said in an interview Tuesday. Quote, "Obama got the votes much more so than his data processing machine. And I think the same is true with me." The term data processing machine jumped out at me because it sounds like something you try to order from Texas Instruments and seemed to betray perhaps lack of familiarity with what modern campaigns do, the data that they have access to, the tools that they use, the types of tactical and strategic decisions that they make from it. So I thought we would start by, for our benefit, if not Mr. Trump's, showing him a data processing machine and what it knows about him, and then working backwards. So I asked Tom, so Tom's firm, Target Smart, which you heard about, is basically the largest collector data, vendor of data on the Democratic side. They manage the voter file for the Democratic National Committee. Democrats across the country will be using data that they collect and organize and make available for all sorts of communications contact that they have this fall. And so what I asked Tom to do was, do you want to just get started?
Yeah.
So why don't you sort of walk us through what you'll be using is what I think we would describe as the sort of primary tool that Democratic campaigners will be using to access data, right? This is
it. I mean, if a Democratic candidate, you know, I've never actually been aware of a dog catcher being elected, but that's the typical term we use. Anyone from the presidential campaign down to dog catcher on the Democratic side will be using this. And
software called the VAN, Voter Activation Network.
Voter Activation Network. And any of you who have worked or volunteered on Democratic campaigns probably see this as familiar, though this is the new version. So there's a lot about this. Oops.
I'm tempted to take pictures. Can I do that?
Please.
Is that okay?
This is great.
It actually is going to make me log in again, I realize, most likely because it's been quiet for a minute. We'll give it a second here.
But so anybody who is putting together a list of doors to knock on a walk list, a phone list that's going to a volunteer phone bank to call, is basically going in through this and searching for what they would call universes of people to contact. We are going to go look for just one.
We only need one Trump.
And there is Donald J. Trump. That is the address for Trump Tower. So the fact that he's in there suggests that he's a registered voter? Can we conclude that, or he could be an unregistered voter?
Well, so actually, we do have unregistereds here.
Okay.
But for the most part, you're going to be finding registered voters, and there is a
So you'll have close to
registration
200
status.
million Americans access in here, right?
So there's 191 million registered voters. There's 255 million people on our file total. So the rest are people who have consumer history but aren't registered to vote. Donald Trump, again, is registered to vote.
So why don't you walk us through what we know about him here?
So I'll show you some of the basic top-line information. There's information that would come from just public registration data. The fact that he is registered as a Republican, he is a man. He was born on June 14th. I actually didn't realize he has a birthday coming up soon, which is exciting. And he registered to vote on July 1st, 1987. So he's been
At that address or in New York
Well, so
State?
this will actually follow him throughout. So if someone moves, they can actually move. He could have, I know, presumably he could have been at that address back then, but he could have registered if this were someone else in California and then moved to New York State, and that history would follow them along because we track it. We track the information everywhere. And then there's other information that perhaps isn't available on voter registration. And
so let's go back. So all of those 5 things are coming from a publicly available document at the New York Board of Elections or the city registrar, wherever you sign up to vote.
Well, presumably gender and race wouldn't.
That's right. Gender and race
Now,
wouldn't.
now in southern states, in Voting Rights Act states, they are required to collect ethnicity.
Okay.
And so that does come directly off of the voter file. But in a state like New York, they're not required to collect that. So that would be what we call imputed from predictive ethnicity models that a lot of the commercial data providers do.
Okay, so we'll go back to that in a second. So now what?
So beyond again, we'll talk about that, the fact that he's listed as Caucasian, we have basic information that's important for campaign contact, his address, obviously.
Penthouse, PA. Penthouse.
That's right. He is in the penthouse. His phone number, if anyone wants to try him while we're here.
And so where do we think his phone number came from?
So we have 3 different sources for phone numbers. They're all consumer data sources. They could be as simple as from a phone directory, where you're able to get data from phone directory. Obviously, they won't have cell phones, so there are companies who sell cell phone numbers. We can talk a little bit more about how those numbers are actually compiled. But again, it's multi-source. So you see here, we actually have 2 different numbers here. One, which
Looks like
looking
an
at that
office address
number,
or corporate
would
number.
presumably be an office number, the fact that it ends in 3 zeros. And then there's another one here, which is a little bit more accurate and suggests that people don't actually dial that.
Unless you're seeking vengeance on behalf of Lindsey Graham, in which case this is your time
right.
to give him his comeuppance.
Yeah, he did.
We also have information more specifically on what precinct he lives in, or election district, as they call it in New York, which congressional district, state senate, assembly, which media market he's in, city council, and school district. Here's an interesting one. So, voting history.
So what is that now, that grid that we're looking at?
What this tells us is which elections he's voted in and which he hasn't. Now, this goes back to 2005. We have history going back further than that. That would be rare that a campaign would actually use data that would go back further than that.
And so we have a secret ballot in the United States, but when you go to a polling place or request an absentee ballot, the fact that you voted is a matter of public record. Obviously, for whom you voted is not. And so
he has pretty good vote history. He's voted in almost every general election. Presumably in 2011, 2015, New York didn't have November general elections. I don't know. But just looking at that pattern there, that would be my guess, 7, 11, 15.
So he's voted in mayoral elections and statewide and presidentials going
That's
back
right.
all the way, right?
He's voted in these 2 primaries, and in some cases it says that he took a partisan ballot. So that information is sometimes available, sometimes isn't, depending on the primary. But in this case, in 2010, it says, yes, he voted in the primary, took a Republican ballot. He's voted in municipal elections in 2009, 2005. And that is it. Presidential primary, presumably he voted for himself in 2016, and when that history is uploaded, which will be in the next few weeks, that'll show up.
And so
to you.
how does that information get from the New York City Board of Elections or the New York Secretary of State into your company's database?
So that information is publicly available, though, with different hurdles to cross depending on the state. Each state has different standards of who can get it. Some states are more strict, like I believe Virginia, where I think you have to be a party committee or a candidate to be able to get that data. Most states you can get it. Some states make it easier. Ohio, you can go online and just download the file that lists everyone who's voted in an election. Now, you can't go on there and download a list of everyone who's voted in every election for the last, going back to 2005, but for recent elections, you could get that file. Generally, it's not going to have a lot of information. As Alex said, it's going to have the basic information on generally their party registration, first name, last name, and then an address, their registration address, and not much more. So,
And in some states, the file is free to obtain, and in other states, it can be tens of thousands of dollars.
That's right.
There's one state in particular, I can never remember which it is, but it's one of the states that fortunately is not typically very politically important. It's not a swing state. So I think it's like Alabama or
that's
something.
right. I was going to say
Yeah.
Mississippi.
Maybe-
It's one of the 2. Well, and there's some states where you'll get it on PDF files, and it looks like someone actually wrote out the names by hand.
Yeah.
So we're all getting along slowly and modernizing how elections are managed. But in some cases, it's very cumbersome. In other cases, less so. But that's something that's an ongoing process where we're actually updating the file, generally at least on a monthly basis, not just when elections have happened, vote history, but there are new voters registering all the time, people switching their party registration, switching addresses. So we're constantly updating. There's a lot of other tags that you'll see here that you might wonder what they are. And really, these are categories that campaigns would enter data in to manage their contacts. So if they had surveyed him, now, I'm happy to see that none of our campaigns have surveyed Donald Trump. It would be a waste of their time and energy to do so. So you don't see anything appearing.
But presumably, if you were looking at a Republican database, you would want to see that people had tried to contact him, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And then you see this section of scores, which really gets to an area that I think Sasha's going to want to spend a lot of time on.
So let's have, Alex, why don't you talk, you use the term imputed.
That's right.
You could say modeled, you could say synthetic, but these are things where there's not a hard underlying data source, but you are developing a prediction. Can you sort of just talk about what a statistical model is and how these types of scores are developed?
Yeah, sure. So you may hear us talk about predictive analytics or data mining or micro-targeting more commonly, and we're going to talk a lot about models, right? And the way you build models is basically you take all the information you have about a particular person, and you use that to make some informed estimate about how they're likely to vote, or how likely they are to vote, or what issues that are most important to them. And so the way I like to explain this is that it's basically a very sophisticated form of stereotyping, right? In that all of us kind of have life experiences that lead us to make guesses about who people are that we don't know. You go into a coffee shop and maybe the person in front of you in line, you can look at the book they have with them, the way they're dressed, maybe the car they drove up in, and you could probably make some reasonable guess about who they voted for, just based on these kind of signals that they're throwing off. So for example, if a Prius drove down the street and I asked you guys, did they vote for Barack Obama or Mitt Romney, how many people would guess that the Prius driver voted for Barack Obama? Probably most of you, right? And you're doing that, you're basing that on kind of your history of interaction with Prius drivers and knowing something about them. And that's basically what a model is. And so, but to be a bit more formal about it, if I forced you to be a bit more quantitative with the Prius driver, you may say, well, how many Priuses have I seen with an Obama bumper sticker? How many have I seen with a Romney bumper sticker? And maybe you saw 4 with an Obama bumper sticker and 1 with a Romney bumper sticker, in which case you can back that out to a probability, which says there's an 80% chance that this unmarked Prius is an Obama voter. Yeah, and so you can use these things to make informed guesses about who they are and then communicate with them. And so that's what these models are. We're just doing it with literally thousands of variables, and we're using extremely sophisticated algorithms to do these things. And so typically the way it works is we start with a voter file where we have the information you saw, and then we'll match that voter file into consumer data providers. So there are these large companies, Axiom, Experian, Donnelly, InfoUSA, that basically compile consumer data about.
And these are companies that exist essentially for non-political purposes.
That's right. That's
that
right.
serve direct mail marketers or people who develop credit rating scores,
That's right.
or that have become useful to politics, but these are not fundamentally political companies.
That's right, yeah. And pretty much any time you've ever submitted any information in the fine print of whatever you signed, it says we're going to sell this information. And the information, it's the format of the information we get is detailed enough to be helpful, but not so detailed as to be intrusive. Right, so the example I like to use is like there may be a flag on the consumer file for having a technology interest. And you may be flagged as having a technology interest because you subscribe to Wired magazine, but we don't know that. You may have that flag because you have like a Best Buy rewards card, but we don't know that. We just know that you have this technology interest, that you've given off the signal. But so anyway, we have all this information, literally thousands of variables for each voter, and then we'll call in usually to a large sample of subsample of that group, so 5,000, 10,000 people, and we ask them, who are you voting for? How likely are you to vote? What are your most important issues? And then we build these models inside of that group of people that we talk to. But then we'll go and score everybody, right? And say, if you drive an SUV and you have a Bible in the house and you're a male who's over the age of 50 and you have kids, then you have a likelihood of 0.86 of voting Republican.
And it's basically how much do you resemble the types of people that we've asked who said that they're going to support
Exactly.
Hillary Clinton or vote in November or
Exactly.
care about abortion or whatever it is.
Yeah, so
right?
if we talk to 100 people that fit this profile and 90 of them said, I am voting for Mitt Romney, and we go and look statewide and say, oh, there's 100,000 people that fit that profile, then we can reasonably infer that 90,000 of them are voting for Mitt Romney.
And so I think in an ideal world, every campaign would try to talk to every voter and basically do the equivalent of a census and ask every voter, who do you plan to vote for? Do you plan to vote? What issues do you care about?
That's right.
You can't reach every voter because no campaign has enough volunteers or money, and not everybody answers their phone, and not everybody will talk to you at the door, and not everybody will give you an answer to those questions. And so this is basically a way of using statistics to infer, based on the small group of people that you have talked to, what the people you haven't talked to yet would answer if they were in that situation. Is that?
Well, and I would even take that a step further to say that in an ideal world at this point, we wouldn't talk to every voter because there are so many voters who have already answered the question for us without knowing it, right? If
Yeah.
they're very simple questions that we're seeking to answer. Number one is, are they going to vote or not? Number two is, for whom are they going to vote? And then I'd have a sub-question, which is, are they persuadable? Really, that's the question. There's a lot more in that in terms of which messages they care most about, which are most effective, that you get to after that. But really, those are the questions we answer. And if we can, and the answer to those questions will determine whether or not we want to speak to those people.
Yeah.
And if so, how? Are they someone who we just need to make sure they get out to vote and we have no concerns about whether or not they're going to support our candidate? We're so confident that we don't need to use our resources to persuade them. Or are they someone who we're quite certain they're going to turn out, but there's a strong reason to believe that they could vote for other side, and therefore we need to expend resources to persuade them. And so most voters, I mean, we do live in a very polarized country. Most voters have already answered those questions for us with a high enough degree of certainty that we don't want to spend our, even as the point that Sasha makes is the most important one in a way, that even if we tried to, we couldn't. Right? If we go out, and if I went out and tried to call everyone in the room, I would maybe reach, I mean, far fewer now, right? They used to say polling that you get response rates of 20%, and now you're well down in the single digits, and for a campaign ID, it would be lower than that. And then of the people you reach, most of them will tell you that, I don't know, I'm undecided, I'm independent, when they aren't really. So you all have answered questions already for us without really knowing it, and that's...
So let's look at the assumptions that you've made or have access to about Donald J. Trump on Fifth Avenue.
So, and the important thing to keep in mind...
And read off the numbers because they're very small.
Yeah, I will. And
Okay.
so Alex made the point of talking about 0 to 100, which is really the accurate way to look at this because it's a probability. It's a probabilistic score. So it's 0% to 100%. These are presented as whole numbers just for the sake of ease, and it's help you. So 0 to 100, same thing. Those are percentages. So I'm not going to read all of these, but whether or not the likelihood that they have children in the household is a very simple model. That's actually not a survey-based model. It's a 3% chance. It's just based on the fact when we look at the data for that address, there are very few indicators. From a consumer viewpoint, you wouldn't expect to see children on the file anyhow. But he's a 69-year-old man, and so very few 69-year-old men.
Not a lot of kids living in Trump Tower.
That's
too.
right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Although he does have a child, right? Doesn't?
I
is
don't
it
know.
9-year-olds?
I don't know if they're.
Yeah.
Oh, does he?
Yeah. Yeah.
This is a probability that he's progressive on issues like climate change, and 43%, which is interesting. The probability he's graduated from college. That he's progressive on gun control. Alex might agree with some of these scores, though the Donald himself probably wouldn't. I'm going to go through these. These are some on religion.
And on the issue ones, from your perspective, 100 tends to be liberal.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. This is an interesting one. There's the model suggests there's a 76% chance that he would be in favor of legalizing marijuana. So now keep in mind, if that model is accurate, that means if you talk to 100 people, 76 of them will say yes. I believe in legalization of marijuana, and 24 of them will say no. Yeah. So it's not binary. It's a probabilistic score.
And the thing to keep in mind when you look at these, especially with this, which is revealing, is like it's the sum total impact of each of these individual variables on that propensity. And if you think about Donald J. Trump, he's throwing off a very strong signal that he's more conservative in that he's a registered Republican. So that's huge. However, he lives on Fifth Avenue, right, in New York City. That right there is going to bring him down towards the liberal side many points, right? His income is, we'll have to wait and see his tax returns if he ever releases it. But presumably his income is very high, which will skew him more towards the liberal side. And so there's there's that push and pull. And so it's not surprising to see him be middle of the road on a lot of these issues.
That's right, on the issue scores. But here's the party score, and 9% probability that he would self-identify as a Democrat. 95% chance that he's going to vote in the general election this year. Seems about right. Here's another turnout score, and you'll see we get scores from different sources. So here's another model on turnout that suggests it's a 97% probability, 28% chance that he is a progressive. This partisan model has a slightly more dim view, 5% probability they would self-identify as a Democrat, 43% chance they would vote in a primary. Again, you saw his primary history was more spotty than his general election history, so that's where that comes from. 84% chance that he would identify with the Tea Party. So, these end up being a bit all over the map. Now, someone might ask the question, well, most of these things about Donald Trump. So why are these models, in some cases wrong? Presumably, who knows what Donald believes when the doors are closed? And it's because these are models. These are, as Alex said, these are built off of talking national models to tens of thousands of people and building a score. So you don't go back in and find your aunt, your uncle, your cousin, your Donald Trumps and say this one's right, this one's wrong, and change. I mean, campaigns actually will when they move to hard communication and using hard IDs. But from a model perspective, this is just what the computer knows after sifting through thousands of data points and tens of thousands of survey responses.
Yeah, and like, there's an expression we use, which is there's always a Texan living in Chinatown, right? There's always somebody who throws off the model who doesn't fit the prior expectations. I mean, if you look at me, like, I live in DC in a census block that's like 98% African American. I drive a hybrid car. I subscribe to the New Yorker. Like, I listen to NPR, right? You would think that I'm a liberal, except I'm a registered Republican. So you would, there are instances where you throw off the model. That's bound to happen.
And so, how many, you said thousands, Alex, how many different variables are we talking about that just you have access to when developing a model?
I would say low thousands. Right.
And so this includes, so break down let's go back to where these are coming from. Some of those from the voter registration record. Mm-hmm. The consumer stuff is that wide variety of categories that people get put in. This is the past interactions that campaigns have had with them.
Yeah, so organizations like the Republican National Committee are pooling all of the contact efforts that every campaign has ever done. So we've got campaign contact codes going all the way back to like 1998, though. I mean, are those 98 contact codes useful anymore? No, not really, although every once in a while
right.
They are. But yeah, so we have those. We'll put things like census data into the models, which will be helpful.
So one of the things that's probably predicting whether Donald Trump has a child in the House is the fact that he's probably in a census tract at 5th Avenue and 58th Street, where there are very few children living in, in apartments, right? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the sort of socioeconomic stuff and household type stuff is informed by the complexion of somebody's neighborhood,
That's right? Yeah.
So want to tell us what this is?
Yeah, I have a few quick data points to share because you'll see in the models, we talk about the consumer variables a lot, and I'm sure we'll talk about privacy issues at some point in the conversation. But when it comes to the models that are most useful, the campaigns primarily are using turnout scores and partisanship scores or candidate support scores, scores that tell you the likelihood someone's going to vote and the likelihood they're going to vote Democratic or Republican. And really, this is the actual breakdown of the partisan model that I just showed you for Donald Trump. And from top to bottom, this shows you...
So these are the individual variables that are helping to that 5% or 9% prediction.
That's right. And there's actually more variables. So our file, the base file, has about 1,500 columns of data appended to each individual, and the vast majority of them are useless.
Yeah.
But you keep them around because there's that one great moment. There's one model where this weird data point, and I'm going to show you some.
Give us examples of things that are useless.
Well, I've got a good story about that actually.
I'll actually show you. I'll show you really quick. I'll show you this, and I'll show you some of those other variables that generally are useless but end up being helpful. But you'll see in this party model, it's actually fairly boring in my mind. Data fields. Number one, what party you're registered in is not surprisingly the strongest predictor of which party you'll identify with. Percent of Democrats in the household, who you live with. That election base is actually precinct level election return. So how your precinct votes is generally predictive of how, not surprisingly, individuals will vote. If you voted in a partisan primary, either way, past turnout. Contributor data. The Federal Election Commission maintains a database of your contribution history, and so not surprisingly, that is helpful in predicting which party you'll vote for. Age, and then there's another contribution variable.
And age
there.
goes, the older you are, that Trump's age is, the fact that he's older is pushing him to be more likely to look Republican? Or that changes from location to location?
Possibly, but really, these variables aren't necessarily simply positively or negatively correlated. sometimes they have to be interactive. So it's age plus gender might mean something. So being an older man versus a younger woman could mean something different. So this, and I apologize, I just blacked out when I went to a full screen here, and I don't want to lose it again. But to give you a sense, this was another model where you see some of that data and partisanship, whether or not someone's...
Very quickly explain to us how to read this.
This is it's called a radar chart. So basically it shows you the further out the chart goes, the more powerful predictor that variable was in the model. But really, you keep in mind that this is among 1,500 different data points. So for a data point to make it into the model, it's a powerful predictor. And this is where you see some of that weirder data coming out. DBI is it's a consumer data source. You see people tagged as people who are into finance or own stocks, people who have...
And so where do we think where that information is coming from, Alex? The finance or stock thing?
It could be maybe you subscribe to Kiplinger's, right?
Okay.
Or maybe E-Trade sold their customer file to somebody. It could be any one of those things. We don't know.
Okay.
But so again, it's helpful enough to be predictive, but not so helpful that it's intrusive.
Okay.
That's right. Homeowners insurance, whether or not someone's a likely executive as their occupation. Alex mentioned this earlier, technologically advanced. It's something that pops up in a lot of models. Mm-hmm. Whether or not someone who is likely to have traveled internationally in the last year. A lot of these are actual models. You're using a model as an input into another model. And again, as you mentioned earlier.
And the travel in the last year could have been developed for a travel agency or
almost
for
certainly
American
was.
Airlines to start.
None of these variables were created with political purposes in mind.
Okay.
Yeah. And yet, some of them are incredibly predictive in terms of political behavior. So, like, especially on the right, there are two that are just phenomenally helpful, which is one, whether I referenced it earlier, whether or not somebody has a Bible in the household, and what that really means is they purchased something from a Christian bookstore, or some other similar item, and then also whether they have a hunting and shooting interest, and that may be a compilation of publicly available information on hunting licenses. But it also may be, you subscribe to, guns and ammo, right? Or fishing interest is fishing license. That's very helpful as well. Yeah.
You asked for an example of some weird data points. There was a race we were working on back in 2012, and it was on a county in Arkansas that was having a ballot initiative to consider becoming a dry county, banning alcohol sales. And we built a model on support or opposition for that initiative, and we found that the consumer variable that was most predictive of a position on that was whether or not you are likely to own a boat, which seems weird at first, and then you think about it. There are a lot of lakes in Arkansas, and when you go out on the weekends, Memorial Day weekend coming up, you go out in your boat and you drink. And so it's interesting. You'll see things like that. Now, that was a data point that likely was never used in the partisan model before in our shop.
Was it important to you that you could come up with a story about why that made sense? Mm-hmm. What if you couldn't? What if it had been owns jet skis, where maybe you
It happens all the time that you can't.
And do you question whether it's actually predictive, or?
I don't question, because the process itself includes enough stringent validations that you believe in the accuracy of the model. But by having the context that's provided by that, it opens up a door to more contextual communication. If you know that support around this, without even polling on it, has something to do with owning a boat, well then that changes how you want to talk to people and to whom you want to speak. And talk about, well, hey, if you're opposing it, that, well, if this passes, you're not going to be able to go out and drink on your boat.
So I've got a great, completely relevant story to this line of discussion, which I've only started telling it this year because I feel like the statute of limitations is up there. So in 2008, I was building primary models for support for Mitt Romney in New Hampshire, okay? And there was one variable which kept showing up no matter how I did the modeling. Like every single time this variable showed up, and I was convinced it was what we call overfitting, that it was some remnant in the data, some artifact in the data. It wasn't explaining anything, but it just kept showing up and kept showing up. And it, to the degree that I had to finally say there's something here. And then it finally clicked. because it was breaking against support for Romney, and the model was telling me that dog owners were opposed to Mitt Romney in the primary. And it finally clicked that this is, I don't know if you remember, but there's a story about Mitt Romney and how the family went on a cross-country vacation, and they put the family dog in a kennel and put the kennel on top of the car as they drove across country. And this was, Gail Collins famously wrote in the New York Times like 50
Over
different
and over
times
again,
about this. And so, yeah, it was having an
amazing.
impact. Yeah.
So you just came off of the Bush campaign.
Yeah.
You guys were, while you were around, as sophisticated, I think, as any of the Republican campaigns. Just in a given day, what are like the range of campaign activities, either in headquarters in Miami or out in any of the states, that are being affected by this data?
So we're now at a point where we're impacting pretty much every single component of a campaign. I mean, analytics is, it took us a while to get here, but I think, and I'm sure it's the case on the Democratic side now, where we're informing almost every decision that's made short of policy. You know, the one department on the Jeb campaign that I had an initial meeting with, and we kind of walked out of there agreeing I couldn't really be helpful, was policy. But, you know, so that means obviously the targeting, that was really the heart and soul of what we did and really what we spent, you know, the lion's share of our time on. But we're also doing digital analytics.
So targeting is shaping what types of actual activities?
Who we communicate with.
And this is through
mail and phones and door knocks, but then also through digital advertising and even TV advertising now too. And so we're informing the digital components of the campaign. We're doing digital analytics by monitoring Google search trends. We're also doing A/B testing on our website. So that would mean things like, you know, half of the visitors who come to the website have a green donate button and half get a red donate button. And, you know, we test it over a few days, and whichever button gets clicked on more kind of wins. And then we distribute that to all people, right? And we'll do A/B testing of email too with a similar idea. But we're also helping with donor modeling. So we'll identify good donor prospects for the finance department. You know, you name it now, we probably have some impact into that realm. Even with communications, we were helping to identify what local news broadcasts were most likely to be watched by our persuasion group. And then orienting earned media efforts towards those local broadcast stations.
And so, Tom, Alex mentioned digital, but almost everything we've seen here seems basically offline. And we know that Donald Trump is active on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And yet, almost all of this seems like very old-fashioned consumer activity we're talking about subscribing to magazines or going to Best Buy. There's not a lot of internet in this. How much is the world of this voter data connected to, let's say that, you know, are you able to link Donald Trump in this case as somebody who's active on the internet to what we know about him as somebody who lives on a certain address on Fifth Avenue?
So that's really the next frontier. And there are some not insignificant hurdles, but there's sort of two phases to that. The first challenge is being able to take the findings, which are quite robust, as you can see, where we really know a whole lot about most people. And so the questions that I mentioned, we can answer those questions with a pretty high degree of certainty for most people. And then we know we want to speak with them or not. And the challenge is, from a digital perspective, is then being able to find them online. That's one challenge, and I think we've gotten pretty good at that and being able to match voter data to online data.
And that's cookies or IP addresses.
That's initially it was cookies, and then IP addresses, and now, you know, we've been able to, we call it onboard our voter file with a whole bunch of digital content providers using PII, personally identifiable information. Now, it's information that those providers will never, Facebook is not going to tell us everything they know about you. They wouldn't give away their keys to the castle. So we work with third-party intermediaries who can match data from Facebook and our data and create a handshake, so then our campaigns can then advertise directly and take the findings of these models and go directly to those voters, whereas in the past with cookies, it's much less reliable.
So if theoretically you decided that you wanted to put ads in front of Republicans who looked moderate on climate change or guns or whatever it was that Trump fell into that, and you in New York State, right, and you found 10,000 people who fit that category. You could go to Facebook, and they would be able to serve an ad to Donald Trump without it specifically going to him, but because he was part of a collection of attributes that you had found on the voter file? Is that
Well, no, because it was him.
because it was him? Okay.
Because it was him. And generally it'd be, between a third to 40% of a universe would match. But and that's something that's been available for a little while now. What's a little bit different about what we're doing is we've been able to have that match done based on PII, not just an email address that you can upload. So you have a higher match rate, and that's something that exists in perpetuity. So a campaign can go online, and they can go onto Facebook now, and if they're a campaign that's working through the Democratic Party, they see these models in the Facebook ad buying platform and can buy against that, buy specific universes. But the question you asked is more about data coming back, where all of you, not all of you, but a lot of you, I imagine, are putting a lot of information out into the world at large on the internet, right? That's where people, especially not to pick on millennials, but millennials tend to be more comfortable with this, sort of living their lives online. And that's information that's really interesting to people like Alex and me, because what you're putting out there tells us a lot in terms of, again, answering those questions. But the challenge goes back to figuring out who the online person is and matching that to the voter file. And again, that's where we've made great strides. A lot of that, I don't want to get too much in the weeds. There are some platforms that are easier to collect that information, like Twitter and Pinterest, and there are other platforms that make it very difficult. But there are a lot of smart people doing smart things in that space, being able to get, people talk about social listening, where you can match people and their online profiles back to member files, voter files, that sort of thing, and use that sort of like an online focus group. And then that information can then feed into models and make these models even smarter.
Yeah, it's interesting because digital throws off a ton of data, but it's frequently not attributable to a person that we can find on the voter file. And it's making that bridge.
Why is that?
that's
Because you
tough.
can't actually match them, or doesn't have a real name
because
attached to it?
There's no real name attached to it, and sometimes the companies won't voluntarily make that connection. Now, there are some ways, like with the TV data we work with, where there's a way to anonymize this. So like, my company does a lot of work with set-top box TV data. So basically, every time you hit the remote control, you change the channel, it creates a new row in a data set with a date and a timestamp of the station you went to. And what we can do is we can flag a group of voters ahead of time and say, these are swing voters, and we're very interested in what they're watching on TV. And we give that to a third party. And then, Comcast and Charter and Cablevision, those guys will give their set-top box data to that third party. They'll match it, and they'll give it back to us blinded and anonymous. And so I can't know what John Smith watched on TV, but I can know that this box watched this, and this box belongs to a swing voter. And then we can then go optimize a television buy, like a basket of programs that they should buy if they really want to hit these swing voters. Right? So there are ways to kind of work around these hurdles that we have so that it's still useful to us.
And have you guys seen, there's obviously, particularly since the Snowden stuff, been a big conversation in the United States about online privacy. Still not a lot of a conversation in this country compared to other countries about offline privacy. Has any of that changed how you guys approach what you do in politics?
Yes, in that, we've always been very concerned about security, and now we're even more extremely concerned about it. I know on the Jeb Bush campaign, on the day we announced, we had North Korean hackers trying to get into our stuff, and so.
Are they the ones that sold the winning strategy?
Yes, they are. But
how do you think he gets 99% of the vote in Pyongyang?
Yeah.
That was your plan.
But so we were very concerned about operational security at the campaign. We had security briefings. We became very concerned about it. So,
questions? Are we ready? So we'll take some questions. If you want to line up, there's a microphone in the center aisle.
All right. Hi, thank you all for coming. My question is about Ted Cruz, actually. I know he's not in the race anymore, but there were a few articles about his psychological profiling tactics that I found particularly interesting and troubling. And so I was wondering what you made of
Why troubling?
make of that. I don't know, there's something uneasy about it, but I mean, I'm open to hearing more about like, you know, how the tactics work, how, if you guys know how like he would create psychological profiles for people in order to canvass them better, and if that was effective, and you know what potential there is in that arena.
Well, Sasha, you wrote you probably wrote one of those articles that
Yeah,
we
I
read.
probably, I probably freaked you out. So if you didn't sleep sometime in October. Cruz's campaign worked with a firm called Cambridge Analytica, which is attached to a firm in London called SCL that specializes in what they call psychographic profiling. And this grew out of tools that they sort of said that they developed for non-political purposes, for conflict resolution, counterterrorism efforts. But the idea is, instead of just trying to sort of profile voters based on partisan attributes or their position on issues or political behavior, to try to create psychological profiles for voters with whom they have not interacted directly. And so what they ended up doing was scoring every voter in the United States, in addition to stuff, as you'd imagine, on issues and Tea Party scores and a lot of the stuff you see there, where they ranked on the 5-factor OCEAN, which the openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, A, neuroticism. I don't know what the A is. Anybody?
Any psychology majors?
Affective. Anybody study psychology here? No? It's not in the core? Anyway, so they came up with, they scored people and came up with predictive models that scored people based on this. It was a bit of a mystery to me in my reporting exactly how they got, how they developed these models, since you guys can call 1,000 people and ask them, do you support Hillary Clinton and are you pro-choice? It's not easy to call 1,000 people and give them a 120 question battery.
Wasn't it a Facebook personality
yes.
quiz?
So there was some what I ended up sort of discerning was that they had used a Facebook personality quiz to mine that there's an app that you would see as, this is fun, I'm going to share it with my friends because it told me that I'm neurotic and open or whatever. That people in some significant numbers completed this quiz, which was developed at Cambridge, at the university in the UK. They used, and then when people signed, agreed to open up their likes on Facebook when they installed this app, and that they used the pool of Facebook likes to create models for other voters. And at some point, I believe Facebook cut off their access to this, because it was sort of deemed beyond what Facebook has a huge incentive, obviously, to control this data for all sorts of reasons. But so they created this pool of data. One of the challenges was figuring out how to make it useful in a campaign. And I think there was a huge gap between the potential of what they were able to do with their analysis and what they actually, when it came down to it, you know, you can know a lot about whether to show voters in Iowa a digital ad about Obamacare without knowing how extroverted they are. And ultimately, I think the campaign did a lot less with it than the people who developed it claimed that they could have.
Yeah, I think they would argue that knowing these personality traits allowed them to not necessarily target the issue they spoke to them about, but how they talked to them about that issue. And so from what I understand from the academic literature, the jury's still a bit out in terms of the power of the big 5 kind of personality traits on predictive modeling, but they say it works. So,
so one of the challenges that they had was, so they created 150-something different clusters of voters in Iowa. So they took these 5 personality axes and then added on top of them, are you likely to be evangelical or Tea Party, all these sort of factional categories, along with some issue priorities, local and national issues. They came up with more than 150 categories. And there were about 300,000 people they consider potential voters in Iowa. You get down to some of these categories, and they are in the hundreds of people, right? You're getting to Republicans who occasionally vote in caucus, who occasionally participate in caucuses, who identify with the Tea Party but are highly neurotic, but are low on openness, and also care more about Obamacare than they care about guns. You get down to like 400, 600 people in Iowa, and you can't send direct mail practically to fewer than a couple thousand people. You can't buy digital ads in that number, just the amount of staff that it takes to manage it. And so I think in this whole conversation about data, there's a big disconnect between how granular you can get in your targeting and what is just practical in the context of a campaign. And probably you'd go a long way if you just sent every Republican caucus goer in Iowa a piece of mail saying, I'm going to destroy Obamacare. You'd probably get 90% of the way towards reaching the people you want to reach on what they want to hear about. And the question, they had all the money and all the time in the world to try to tweak with that extra 10%.
I just want to say, reflecting on it more, I think I was uneasy just the idea of Ted Cruz having this information, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hey.
So you alluded to the idea that it's really hard to know from polls alone if someone's telling the truth or if they're actually going to vote the way they say they're going to vote in a poll or if they'll vote at all. And so I was wondering how these models help you tell what kind of questions people do lie about, and then if they're lying or just kind of being a little bit dishonest, how they help you predict what the person will actually do on voting day.
Yeah, I mean, voters lie. It's something we have to accept. I don't think the models necessarily help tell us when someone is lying. Like, we can't go to them and say, well, this model says that you're supporting Hillary Clinton, but you say you're supporting Trump, so you must be lying. It's more that that's something that we just have to work around. It fills in the gaps, meaning someone might tell you, you ask them, for whom are you voting? And they say, I'm undecided. They say, I'm an independent. I don't vote on parties. People say that all the time. You have conversations like this, right? But then you start talking to them and you get 2 minutes further down the road and you know exactly which candidate they're supporting, right? Because they'll start ranting about Obamacare or, the other way around, right? There are certain issues. And those are questions, we can find questions that people are more comfortable answering that are also helpful in predicting vote choice or different issue preferences, and we can use those. But, and there are some cases where we do have data points. People lie a lot on the question on whether or not you are going to vote. And because, as you saw up here, we see vote history afterwards. We know if people have voted or not. We have some experience and some data, and especially in states where they have early votes, where people are being polled and we know they've already voted. We did this in Oregon and found that it was a little bit over 20% on both sides were lying, either saying that they had voted and they hadn't, or saying they hadn't voted and had. So it's more something you need to work around than anything else.
Yeah, if anything, there are enough people that tell the truth that it pulls the propensity scores of the liars into a better territory.
That's right.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is, is there any numbers on how effective these data methods are for actually swaying elections? Like, is there any way to say that employing these methods caused a 2% shift in how people turned out, and whether or not any party has a different approach to how they go about this, or whether or not it's the same for both parties?
Yeah, so there's a ton of evidence that this stuff does work. And really it's live by the data, die by the data, right? So we're coming in and saying that we have these amazing statistical methods to identify who people are. Well, then we should be able to quantify our impact too. And really that's how we proved our usefulness in the very beginning, is we're able to run randomized controlled trials, right? RCTs, they're like clinical drug trials, where we can basically randomly, communicate with some people, randomly not communicate with others, and measure who voted and who didn't, because it's public record who voted. Or we could do a survey into them and ask them who they voted for and identify the impact of these things. And there's also all sorts of other very interesting analyses, like you can study the impact of TV ads, because there are some media markets that bleed into states, you can measure the impact of turnout operations, because there are some media markets that bleed into states that are not swing states, right? And so you can look at the difference between people who are in the media market in a normal state versus a swing state. And so, we go to great lengths to really prove our effectiveness. Now, how much is it worth? Only a few points, like 1 or 2 points is what we say.
In the end, it depends. We can validate that the process works, and we know that the process works, right? That if you go through that process, Alex just mentioned, that we can find who those right people are, what the right message is, and laser target to those people and have that stronger impact. But if your candidate is a total dud, if you don't have the issues on your side, if your mail is not very good, if your digital is not very good, then the effect you're going to see is going to be smaller. By going through these processes, you will still have a better effect than if you didn't do it. But then on the other hand, when you have a great candidate, great message, great mail, great communication, the right messenger mode, everything at the right time, then you look at it and say, well, these tactics were amazingly effective. So there are numbers that we throw about, but yeah, it's generally a few points. If you're looking at a presidential campaign, both sides are equally competent or in the same ballpark, and one side's doing this and one side's not, then you'd expect one side to have a few points.
I mean, the least sexy thing that I think is universally true, regardless of whether you have a good candidate or a bad candidate, it just helps you be more efficient with money that you're already going to spend, right? And so, just being able to be more refined about determining who's likely to already vote for you or likely to never vote for you, and make sure that you're not sending them mail or knocking on their door or that you're putting digital ads in front of them. I mean, just think about if Hillary Clinton's going to spend $1 billion this year, put out what she spends on salaries and offices. Just say that $500 million of that is paid communications of some kind, TV, digital, voter contact. If she can just be 5% more efficient about narrowing, pushing people out who are extraneous to what she wants, that's $25 million in cost savings, right? And so that I think is, if you were being intelligent about this and applying it widely across your campaign, then at the very least you might keep on doing what you would do normally. You should just be doing less of it and targeting what you do better.
It's the efficiency argument is actually why we're most frequently brought in. Frankly, that's how we first got into campaigns. We didn't come in and say, we're going to win the election for you. We came in and said, we're going to save you millions of dollars. And they said, I'm listening. And we're like, oh, by the way, this is going to help you win, right? That makes a big impact. But yeah, look, hate to use a sports analogy, but we're the field goal unit. We're not scoring touchdowns, but we're kicking extra points and field goals.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You both have referred to vote by mail and early voting. How do the analytics support that, making it more effective for candidates to get at that? And how do you avoid what you made a reference to, people who've already voted and getting them out of wasting money on them?
Yeah, I love the vote by mail and the early vote, if for no other reason than we talk about efficiency. It can make campaigns so much more efficient because you can just take someone off the list, right? There's someone who was slated to get 7 pieces of mail and 3 door knocks and several phone calls. They voted, they're gone, right? I just saved that money. You can bank that
And in
vote.
many states, you're finding out the day that they request or the next day.
We'll get
That's right.
daily updates.
Same day.
Daily updates on who's requested a ballot and who's
That's right.
returned a
And
ballot and who's
returned
gone
it.
to an early
So
location.
you can chase the ballots, and
Yeah.
we do. But also, the other thing that we love about it is that you don't have to wait until the polls close on election night to know how you're doing.
Yeah.
And so that's the story, that people tell of the Obama campaigns, but this was not unique to the Obama campaign, was that they knew in states like North Carolina that had heavy early vote, they wait to see a few precincts come in and then call it and know how they're going to do, right? Because such a large share of the electorate had already voted, and those models exist on every voter, and they validated those models over the months before, so they know, they have a confidence in them. And just looking at who's voted and then how a tiny sample of the election day vote comes in, you know how you're doing. And so in the week leading up to election day, you'll see campaigns making resource allocation decisions based on that. Based on generally within the state that that we're doing better in these areas, so let's move more of the field effort to another area.
Yeah, 100 people voted. You can look at those propensity scores and just sum them up and say, oh, it sums up to 80. We think we probably got 80 votes out of this.
Yep.
Right, and more often than not, you're right.
Yep.
Within a few points.
So kind of a two-part question just about the data. How do you say a variable is predictive if you can't tie it out to what they actually did in the voter box? So what I'm assuming is you take a sample of people that voted, then you do an exit poll. You kind of go based on what they told you they voted, and then you apply that out to the population that went into your model. Is that how you attribute the predictive, I guess, quality of your variables?
Well, the initial, initially we do a survey canvas, right? And people tell us who they're voting for. And that's where we build the predictive models off of, right? So we have that, and now in terms of validating the models after the fact, we can do post hoc surveys, or we can look to precinct level results versus our models, right?
That's
Similar
right.
for you.
But what I think, just to be clear, right? So on some level it says you will have scores that predict how likely somebody is to vote for Hillary Clinton, and you'll call that a Hillary support score. But really what you're predicting is the likelihood that somebody will tell a surveyor that they are voting for Hillary Clinton, right?
Yeah.
Which is a difference.
Yeah,
And so
yes.
you're not
Literally, yeah.
necessarily, because you can't, right? This gets back to people lying, that ultimately you can never predict against a private activity that people don't publicly disclose. And so you're stuck just creating a model against people, against the action of saying
That's
that
right.
you
Yeah.
support climate change or whatever
That's
it is.
right. The belief is that there's a very strong correlation between having a probability that's saying if I called this person on this day with this sort of phone call and asked them this question, that they would answer that way and how they would vote, right? If someone has a high probability of answering the phone and saying, yes, I'm voting for Hillary Clinton, there's going to be some margin of error there in terms of that actually turning into a vote. But the correlation is strong enough that you're going to be entirely comfortable with it.
But obviously, the easiest thing to validate is the turnout thing, because you know afterwards
Yes.
to Donald Trump, we made a prediction, is he going to vote in this primary? And he either did or he didn't, and you find that out, and you have that for every voter, you don't have to call them.
That's right.
And so that's the
Yeah.
cleanest thing to sort of
That and our
test.
donor models,
Right,
donations.
yeah, is somebody going to
are
give or
known
not,
things.
right?
So the other part to this was, how do you build primary keys to source these attributes? So if my name's Brian Jensen, and I'm sure there's 10 million Brian Jensens
Yeah.
out there, is it that plus address plus some other thing, or plus social security? Like, how many primary keys do you build on people? Like, how do you do all these? How many databases exist for one person to source in all of these multiple?
So we're sort of data hoarders, and I imagine you guys are too, or the folks you work with on the data end, where we have a national file that actually has 1.3 billion records in it. There's only, that's far more than the population of the United States. So what that means is anytime someone moves or they change their name, maybe they got married and took a different name, anything, we are keeping that record, which allows us to match. So a common occurrence might be the Kerry campaign. Whoever is managing that donor list from John Kerry's campaign in 2004, which it still exists somewhere, right? Someone owns that. And they might say, here, Clinton campaign, you can have our list of, a few 100,000 donors. Well, if you went and tried to match that and actually communicate with those people based on the information you had then, 12 years later, you wouldn't get most of the people. So we can go back and match it to information based on where those people lived then, what their names were then, that sort of thing. So that's a big part of it. It's just really keeping any information that we have along the way.
Well, and also as the ecosystems kind of build out, I'm sure you guys have a persistent ID that runs throughout
That's right.
the van. You have a van ID, right?
That's
and
right.
we have our RNC ID, which campaigns will queue off of. And also, I mean, the consumer data providers are very good at keeping track of this stuff as well. And so you go to Experian or Axiom, you get what they call the Abilitech code is like the key thing there. They're
So
very good at-
theoretically, if Donald Trump changes his registration to Palm Beach, the van ID number would stick with him.
Yep.
And
Which means all the data that we've collected over going back to when you registered to vote in 1980 something, comes with us too. It's not like he'll pop up on the file and saying, who is this guy? And we have to start from scratch.
But when there's nothing, when there's no connection, then we are doing fuzzy match algorithms based off a name, address, birth date, phone number if we have it, things like that.
It's a question for Alex. There's been some discussion recently on the neutrality of platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Google
Yeah.
that algorithmically curate content. So given your proximity to both the data and Republican campaigns, how concerned are you about that? How much do you think about that?
I mean, well, I don't think about it that much, but I mean, it's been in the news a lot. I mean, look, I've seen a lot of good coverage of this issue. Algorithms are not neutral. Algorithms are created by people. The creation process of an algorithm is very human driven. And so That's ominous.
Or a higher power.
And so is there subconscious bias built into those algorithms? I think absolutely. Is Silicon Valley an extraordinarily liberal place? Absolutely. Do I think Facebook is intentionally spiking conservative news? I don't know. But do I think that there's at least some sort of subtle bias against conservatives that's seeping into that algorithm? Yeah, sure, probably. But yeah, the key thing here is that algorithms are not neutral. Algorithms are human-made. Yeah.
Hi. In the beginning, both of you mentioned how you build models based on just sampling and see if there are patterns in there. I was wondering, to what extent do your model also based on like the theories in like psychology, sociology, and all those other like academic areas? And yeah.
So I don't know if this answers your question entirely directly. Where we would use those theories would be more back to the first question about the Cambridge Analytica work. There was an interesting study out of UMass, I believe, that emerged a few months ago where they found that they were looking for demographic variables that were correlated with Trump's support and having a hard time finding them, right? That his support was sort of across age, gender, and the traditional indicators that you would look for to find support groups. And then this UMass study found that one of the stronger predictors of Trump support was whether someone had authoritarian tendencies. Which sounds like a joke, but it's true. And
there's a set battery of questions that
that's right.
Political psychologists have developed for measuring that.
That's right. So we've actually built our own models internally. It's similar research by a professor from NYU, Jonathan Haidt, I believe is his name, called the 5 Pillars of Morality. It's similar to the Cambridge Analytica, but it's a battery of only about 35 questions, but it puts people on 5 different areas. They call it the 5 moral pillars, and we have found that useful. And using it, because again, what it does is it connects what we know about voters to a greater depth of research and psychology. If we can do that and identify, we know who the GOTV, the get out the vote targets are, we know who the persuasion targets are, but once we figure out who they are, we want to know everything about them that we can, right? What's the best way to reach them? What do they care about? What issues are important to them? And by connecting that to research, psychological research, sociological research, can only help us in having more effective communication with them.
Yeah, where we use psychological research the most, I think, is actually in the execution of the communication based on those models. So what you probably heard a lot about are the use of social pressure mailers in campaigns. That's a very frequently used technique now for motivating people to vote. And if you're not familiar, you send a piece of mail to a voter that you want to increase their likelihood that they vote. You list the names of their neighbors, and you put like a voting score next to them, or you show whether they voted in the election. And you send this, supposedly objective mailer that says, hey, we canvassed the neighborhood. Here's your voter support score. Here's your neighbor's voter support scores. After the election, we're going to mail everybody back again and reveal whether or not you voted in this election. And so that's using psychological pressure, the notion of peer pressure, social pressure, to motivate people to go out and vote. And so you see a lot of experimentation along that. So that's not part of the model building process, but a lot of analytics people kind of exist in this world where we're doing randomized trials that are based on the results of psychological research.
Thank you. Well, it's our last question. So
in the beginning of the conversation, you talked about how difficult it's becoming to have like public opinion polling because like we don't have landlines, we hate to answer calls from strangers. And so with that going and with all the data you're getting from other sources, how much do you think that these other data sources can like supplement these opinion polls to make them popular? Like, are they used that way? And in future generation, as these opinion polling getting more difficult, do you see ever that sort of data collection, that sort of models substituting public opinion data and actually used to predict election results?
Well, I would say there's a step in between, or maybe something that's going on at the same time. But you're right. Is more people are. I have a landline in my house that's in my kitchen cabinet. It's literally inside a closed cabinet, and it's just because for some reason Verizon charges you more to not have a phone. So be it. So, and I'm sure I get lots of calls there, maybe some polling calls, and I've never ever answered it. And that's pretty representative of where folks are. So that is a challenge in polling. Number one is getting more cell phones, and that's something we've invested a lot in to make sure we have more cell phones matched to the voter file. That's hard, but we've got a lot of cell phones. But number two is online surveys. And the challenge with that has been, you see, folks out there like SurveyMonkey, or who came at this from a different area, right? SurveyMonkey was something that people would use when they were trying to wrangle friends to, go out for whatever, right? To coordinate schedules. And they've become a bit of an online pollster. But the challenge always was matching the online survey respondent back to the voter file, because that's what we need. If you can't match it back to our data, we can't build models off it, and we can't tell you what to do based on it. So we're working with a lot of folks, and I know folks on Alex's side of the aisle are doing this as well, actually matching. It's a blind match generally, so it's anonymized, but where we can match online panels, the people who take these online surveys, back to our voter file. I think that's an important next step. But I think, to your broader point, as I said before, people are also putting a lot of information out there willingly online through other mediums. The mediums that we're talking about today won't be the same 10 years from now. And so it's always going to be a challenge. But it's one that, at least for now, I think we're pretty on top of. Check back tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of like people volunteering information on Twitter and Google search volume and stuff, it's things we're tracking and that are important for us to kind of monitor trends. Look, the first sign we had that Trump was legit was his Google search volume was off the charts. It was just fantastically high relative to the other Republican candidates. His Twitter discussion volume was massive compared to any other candidate. So are there interesting signals, coming out of those sources? Yes. They're never going to be a substitute for regular polling and the actual formal asking of a question that you need answered to a populace, right? Because, people are volunteering opinions every day on these platforms, but they're not necessarily volunteering the opinions I'm interested in, right? And so, are they helpful? Yeah. Will they substitute for formal polling or even predictive modeling? No, they won't. There's always going to be a need to actually ask people questions. Now, when I retire, 20 years from now, or hopefully sooner than that, will we still be calling people on landline phones? No. How will we be surveying? I have no idea, right? But we've got to figure it out.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Tom. Thank you all for coming.